Hello everyone, we are back here at the Kunstquartier Bethanien for the Disruption Network Lab conference. Very happy to introduce the keynote of today, Science Won't Save Us, What Will? And we have with us Mallory Moore and Oskis that unfortunately could not be with us in person. So we say hello from the virtual world. And we really wish to have Os with us, but this time was not possible for bureaucracy problems. But hopefully it will be possible next time. And also I want to thank Resa-Philip Lunau for the moderation. And I'm very happy also to introduce Resa-Philip as the moderator of this panel, and then he will introduce the panel and the speakers. Resa-Philip Lunau is an analytical philosopher and research assistant in gender study at the Georg August University, Göttingen. He first studied fine arts at Bauhaus University, Weimar, and while studying cultural studies at Humboldt University, Berlin, he was part of Berlin's art scene. During his master's studies of philosophy at Free University Berlin, he became interested in questions of domination and oppression while being actively engaged in community organizing and social work projects on justice from trans people and intersex people. So thank you so much for being with us and thank you for this great keynote that we are all going to enjoy. And now I leave the stage to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to this great panel. It's going to be a presentation by Mallory Moore and Os Keys, like Tatjana already said. And then we have a short conversation with each other, and then the audience can participate. The main idea is that that the presentations and the conversation are going to address the politics of scientific research into trans healthcare, as well as the perniciousness of the current moral panic around conversion therapy and what can be done to improve the current situation. So, Os Keys is a researcher, writer, and activist. They have a background in law, data science, and data ethics. They are currently a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, and their work focuses on the intersection of gender, technology, and power. They are looking at the past, present, and future of research into gender-affirming medicine and will explore how the demand for scientific purity has shaped and warped trans healthcare experiences while having an at best ambiguous impact on the fights to enable access to that care. Rather than debating the science, they argue we should be fighting over the values and fears motivating this backlash. Mallory Moore is a lawless, unregistered transsexual, activist and researcher of cis studies. She will be speaking today about her work at the Trans Security Network, which monitors organized harm targeting the trans community. As a researcher and grassroots activist, Mallory Moore Mallory Moore, as a researcher and grassroots activist with extensive time spent monitoring DIY conversion therapy groups, will talk about some of the practical and widely unacknowledged challenges facing efforts to end conversion therapy and suggest some ways through these. All right. So I think if I'm right, Os is going to start with his talk. So Os, the floor would be yours.
Wonderful. Can you hear me? Grand. I can't actually see the screen that I'm on. So would we be able to, I guess, move the camera focus slightly so that I know where I am in the slides? Is there? Unless I'm not on a screen with slides, in which case I have many more questions. Okay, yay. Can everyone see the slides? Except I can't see you, so how do I know the answer to that question?
Yes.
This is very technology. Okay, cool, thank you. All right. So on that note, hi everyone. As introduced, I'm Os Keys. Here is me looking a lot prettier than I do today. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, and yeah, I kind of study a lot of different things. But the project I'm currently working on is just called Trans Science, which is a philosophy joke and also a pun and also a second pun, because I am the greatest stereotype of British academics to like ever exist, and I use greatest in a very loose sense. And the focus of the sort of trans science project is basically on the politics of trans medicine, particularly hormonal and surgical technologies and techniques. And you know, the politics of this matters. I mean, it always matters, but it matters particularly right now because everyone, I think, who has been paying any attention will know that trans healthcare is under really quite increasing attack. In the United States, you have a whole range of legislation being introduced, particularly in Republican-controlled states, seeking to constrain trans adolescents' access to care as part of a broader moral panic about trans people and children, seeking to constrain trans people's access to public funding for care, constraining like access to ID card changes, the whole kit and caboodle. In the UK, there are court cases, most famously Bell versus Tavistock, and just sort of this general effort to promote the questioning of trans healthcare, which the Cass Review, as well-intentioned as it appears to be, is like a classic example. And this isn't limited alone to the Anglophone sphere, although as a self-hating and like ardently post-colonial British person, ideally wish I could just blame the United States and the United Kingdom. It's also something that we're seeing in Sweden, in France, in Germany. This general attempt to, if not end trans healthcare on the surface, then at least make it so difficult to access and so questioned that you might as well have ended it. And the tactic and sort of rhetoric that people tend to use is about trans healthcare being experimental or unproven or carrying unknown risks and lifelong consequences and being untested. My personal favorite line is this idea of, well, if you give someone treatment, they have to be on a lifelong course of medication, which is hilarious to me because that also describes pretty much every other non-fatal, non-curable disease. Like, you could also say the same thing of diabetes. So this rhetoric, this idea of like, oh, it's experimental, it's unproven, this is really, really common. It's used to justify the bills against trans youth. It's used to justify the exclusions of it from public health insurance systems. And because of this, attempts to fight back against these rollbacks of trans healthcare have largely focused on this rhetoric. So the classic example is, WPATH, the World Practitioners Association for Transgender Health, which I do not know if my slides are actually going forward. Here we go. So WPATH, the World Practitioners Association for Transgender Health, which is the body that sets the standards of care and acts as sort of a clearinghouse for trans people and cis researchers and doctors, primarily cis researchers and doctors, around trans care. Their attempts to push back against all of this legislation, against the attempted cases against the reviews and so on has always focused on this idea of it's about the science, right? They're like, the preponderance of scientific evidence indicates that gender-affirming healthcare can greatly help transgender people. Or Florida's health department is misrepresenting the science on how to care for trans youth. And so there's kind of this taking at face value the rhetoric by opponents to trans healthcare of, oh, we're just concerned about the science. Like, it's experimental. If it wasn't experimental, we'd be totally fine with it. But it's just, we have concerns about the scientific certainty. And probably the peak of this particular take opponents at their word is the actual sort of aggregate response, which has been this journal article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, determining the benefits of gender-affirming surgery, a call for action. And the author list includes the president-elect of WPATH. And the paper says, we have all of these attacks on trans healthcare. You know what we need? We need more studies. We need more science. We need registries. So every gender-affirming procedure should be centrally logged and tracked. And we should spend tens of millions of dollars setting up these surgeries and these studies and setting up these registries. This is how we fight back against this series of campaigns. We fight back by doing science, because you see, they say that it's about the science and about it being experimental. So if we simply prove that it works, then they've got to, come out in favor. Did it just go back one slide non-deterministically? Because I did not hit any buttons. Okay, well, technical difficulties. Could someone who does have a microphone let me know if the slides are actually changing when I hit the clicker buttons?
Changing.
Because I'm not seeing them.
Now we see great, it's
I'm
about
not seeing
science.
them visually change.
Now we see great, it's about science. Now we see the quote again.
Okay, so is it back on the great if it's about science now?
Yes, now.
Hooray, okay, thank you. For some reason, the stream of the slides to me has stalled, so I can't see, but I will just try and make it work. So yeah, if these campaigns are about science, if people are telling the truth when they say it's about it being experimental or unproven, then doing studies and organizing registries of procedures totally makes sense, and it'll really pay off. We'll increase public trust, we'll get scientific certainty, we'll get increased support. Apparently, all of these people who have been introducing transphobic legislation will, in fact, become our greatest supporters, because you see, we did a randomized control test that proves how hormone therapy works. And so, that whole Jesus thing, it turns out, was just eliminated by a p-value below 0.05. On the other hand, if it's not about science, and as you can probably tell from my tone, I don't think it is, then we have a different problem. We have wasted money. Tens of millions of US dollars is a lot of surgical procedures in a very underfunded place. We have misdirected advocacy, and we have wasted time in a moment where a month of wasted time is the difference between people having access to healthcare in an entire country or an entire American or Canadian state or not. I'm just trying to work out how far back the lag is. Okay. So, as you can probably tell from my general tone here, I don't think that it's about the science at all. And to demonstrate that, I want to use two case studies, which are pieces of legislation that have been introduced in Arkansas and Alabama. These might seem pretty abstract from a European context in general and a German context in particular. The reason I'm using them is quite simply that the US is kind of anal retentive about legal transparency. You can access pretty much anything in the courts in the US, unless someone utters the words magic words, national security, in which case no one can access it and you will go to Gitmo. But for everything else, you can just go onto a website and request the documents. And what this means is that I have access to all the internal documents behind this legislation because they were sued over it and they had to give them up. And the results tell a very different story from this is all about science. So let's start with Arkansas. So this is the Save Adolescents from Experimentation, or SAFE Act. It was introduced in 2021 by Robin Lundstrom. And, you know, it looks pretty much like it's about the science, right? It's even got experimentation in the title. And the text says there will be no randomized clinical trials conducted on the efficacy or safety of the use of cross-sex hormones in adults or children for the purposes of treating such distress or gender transition. And this is part of the rationale for what the Act does, which is ban the provision of any gender-affirming care to anyone below the age of 18 and make providing it a criminal offense. And it's in the language of science. Similarly, in Alabama, it's the Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act, and it says, absent rigorous studies showing their long-term safety and positive benefits, hormone replacement therapy and puberty blockers like continued administration to children constitutes dangerous and uncontrolled human medical experimentation. So again, they're talking in the language of scientific rigor, right, and studies. Things are looking up for the it's all about the science crowd. But when you dig into things, you find something very different. So, for example, if we look at the Alabama case and we actually look at the internal records of the legislators behind it, we find that the Family Research Council, which for reference is classified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a anti-LGBT hate group, were really the people pushing for it. They were providing suggested expert witnesses. They actually provided the draft text. They even hooked the organizers up with people who would speak in support of the bill. And to make things most embarrassing, I'm not sure how visible this is, but in the US, when you don't want to turn a document over to the opposition in a court case, you have to list all the documents you're not willing to turn over and what they're about and why you won't turn them over. And in this case, what we have here is one of the examples of documents they wouldn't turn over. And the fun thing is that what it reveals is that the legislator who is apparently just interested in scientific rigor was working so closely with the Family Research Council that the folder the draft text was stored in was literally called 2021 Family Council Legislation. So for an act with experimentation in the title, there's not much science going on here. Things get worse when you look at the actual court cases. What happens when someone goes to try and get this law thrown out? You know, there have been challenges to all of these bills. There will continue to be. And interestingly, whenever the bills are challenged, they always pull out basically the same set of scientific experts. In particular are Paul Perez, who is a professor at Washington University St. Louis, which I call Woostel because one, it's accurate, and two, it's far funnier. Stephen Levine, who is a professor at Case Western Reserve University, and Diana Kenny, who is a professor at the University of Sydney, retired. And these are pretty much always pulled out as the experts. They might be in a different order. There are a few more standard people, but these are the experts, and they testify as to their expert knowledge of how gender-affirming care works and how certain the science is. But there isn't actually much expertise that they have on display. So let's go through in sequence, right? So Paul Perez, again, he is involved as a scientific expert. So it's kind of awkward if you know that he is a consultant to the Catholic Health Association and a consulting fellow of the National Catholic Bioethics Center, organizations that have spent about 5 years campaigning against gender-affirming care on moral and religious grounds, and regularly bring lawsuits explicitly saying that the reason that they refuse to do it is because they have a problem on moral and religious grounds. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that being religious and heavily Catholic means that one can't be scientific. However, Perez is kind of saying that because it's made more awkward if you know that I also have access to a deposition a colleague of his gave about how when they tried to set up a gender identity clinic at Worcester, Perez turned up at the guy's office unannounced and explained to him that he, quote, had a significant problem with the entire issue and the whole idea of transgender, and also said, for me, it is a matter of my faith, and did not discuss or mention that his issues or concerns were based on science. To be fair, Perez is actually doing better in some respects than Levine. So Levine does actually have a lot of expertise in trans healthcare. He helped found the Case Western Reserve Gender Identity Clinic back in 1971 and 1972. But I use had very specifically because in the last few years, he has seen 3 trans people in total in a professional context, all of whom have been his patients for about 20 to 30 years, and 0 trans kids, which makes it kind of awkward when he is testifying on the politics of transition for kids. Not as awkward, admittedly, as when a court threw out his expert testimony and invalid on the grounds that it was full of irrelevancies, inconsistencies, and incoherences. Essentially, this is a mixture of lies and confusion. Why did you bother us with it? And then finally, we have Kenny. So Kenny is a former professor at Sydney University. She has a long-term, psychological and psychiatric practice aimed at kids. And she often testifies with sort of very big documents with embedded graphs about social contagion and gender and trans people, and that's all well and good, but it's not coming from someone in the context of science. It's coming from someone whose other main hobby horse is, in the past, arguing against bans on conversion therapy, before that, arguing against gay marriage, before that, arguing against banning conversion therapy for gay people. And all of this again stems from a really strong faith basis. In fact, she's actually the consultant psychologist to the Catholic Church Tribunal that deals with claims of sexual abuse. And again, while there is no inherent inconsistency between faith and science, I should say that if I was going to trust literally anyone on defining what constitutes child abuse and should be criminalized, it would not be someone whose answers to the question, what constitutes abuse, is acceptable to the Catholic Church. That's just not, they're not going to be on my list, that's all. So really, when you dig into it, as much as these bills and bills like them use the language of science, they're not about science at all. They're about values. In fact, they're about this ongoing campaign against what is called gender ideology, right? Which basically can be understood as anything that happened since 1950. So it's not just campaigning against access to trans-affirming care, it's campaigning against trans-affirming care as part of a broader attempt to fix their vision of like traditional society in place. The two-parent household, a purely heterosexual society, a patriarchal society, one where people do not have control over their own bodies, where people's roles are defined for them. In other words, we should understand this not as specifically transphobic, although in some respects it is, but as part, as these authors argue, of a broader populist and anti-gender movement from which we also see campaigns against abortion access, campaigns against gay rights, campaigns against, well, again, everything since the 50s. And we see some hints of this again in the court documents. So they listed all of the things that they thought were relevant to the writing of the bill that they didn't want to hand over. And one of them is a book titled The Journey Out, How I Followed Jesus Away from Gay. Now, a bill that bans access to trans care, but the author thinks that it's actually about being able to convert gay people through the power of faith, is a pretty sure suggestion that what they're interested in is not even trans care alone, let alone the science of trans care. So all of this is to say that what we're looking at is something that is much broader and deeper than simply a question of, do we have studies about this particular surgical procedure or this particular hormone that are rigorous enough to convince people? Because the people campaigning here have no interest in being convinced. They're not interested in science. They're not exclusively interested in trans people. It is a generalized attack. And our response to that has to be two things. The first is greater tracking. And this is one of the things that Mallory's talk will include, which I am super psyched about. We can follow these people. We can see what they are doing. Some of it requires, some degree of expertise, but to be perfectly honest, working out all of these holes and all of these problems in where do these experts come from, how seriously should we really take them talking about science, that's something that the WPath people who wrote that paper could have done in about 15 minutes. All of these documents are public and online. And the second thing that we should do, and I think focus on, is broader solidarity. And by solidarity, I mean both efforts to coordinate our actions within and without what we might call like trans healthcare, the range of people interested in trans health, from doctors to, well, us. Within that looks like WPath's own complicity in a lot of this rhetoric. It is possible to get from current WPath board members to these expert witnesses and the studies that they are citing in one step. And there is a reason for that. However much WPath sets themselves up as no, we are the good people. We're not into conversion therapy. We're into gender-affirming therapy. The fact of the matter is that their history is a lot more dicey than that, and that a lot of those figures are still present and still mean something to the cis medics who tend to run WPath. But broader than simply, kicking Zucker out of WPath, more broadly, if we understand this not as about trans healthcare alone, but about this broader fight around bodily autonomy, around gender roles, around sexuality, then we need to be trying to form alliances more broadly with reproductive justice and healthcare funding movements to make sure that access to gender-affirming care is understood as part and parcel of the same bodily autonomy that is involved in access to abortion. That access to gender-affirming care is understood as just as important a priority for greater public funding of medicine as anything else. Because ultimately, politics is a numbers game. And if we are going to try and halve the numbers, then that means that we need to be building networks with people who might not look immediately like us, might not have the same interests at heart on the surface, but deep down it is the same thing. The fact of the matter is that the people who are trying to campaign against trans healthcare are happily swallowing sectarian divisions to coordinate. And if they can do that, we can do that, because frankly, they're getting Protestants and Catholics to shake hands and agree on what should be done about Jesus. And if they can do that, then I'm pretty sure that we can make Planned Parenthood sit down for a conversation. We can coordinate these fights, and we can coordinate these campaigns, and we can do better as a result. And that's everything at my end. If you have questions, please raise them at the end. If you have complaints, please file them in the suggestions box in the hall. It looks a lot like a trash can, but don't let that fool you. It is in fact a suggestions box. And if you have flattering compliments or offers of large checks, here is my email address.
Thank you so much, Oz.
Hi. Yeah, so I don't know if my slides are going to come up. Just wait a little minute. So my talk is, I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what us said. We share a lot of views on things, and Oz's discussion of the tracking side of things is actually quite similar to what I probably would have said. So what I'm going to be talking about, as well as tracking, is the ways that technology and science has been directly anti-trans over history, and how that's being exploited, and it's produced the conversion therapy technologies that are in use today, and the power structures that relies on, and how we work towards abolishing them and making trans people free. So a bit about me. My background is in UK-based trans and queer liberation activism, grassroots activism. I am currently a researcher. I founded an organisation called Trans Safety Network, which monitors organised harms, which is a little bit like a hate research network, but we have created our own framework for how we approach that. And that comes out of my background in trans-feminist and abolitionist politics, previously doing research into police violence against particularly the black community and disabled people in my city. So it's coming from a lot of experience in abolitionist politics and trying to do research revealing structures which are doing harm to people. Within that, I'm also going to apologize that I've got a very Anglocentric perspective. A lot of my activism is rooted in my community, and I try and be conscious of that. But like I admit that going into this. I hope some of this is more useful on an international level, but I understand things very different internationally for different people. So I'll talk a little bit about this organized harms idea, which I say is like a hate research group. People are aware of groups like Southern Poverty Law Centre, and in the UK there's Hope Not Hate, and there's other organisations that track and monitor hate groups. And what we are doing differently is that we're not interested in this kind of pathologization of hate. We're not particularly interested in the ideology. We're not imitating the sort of connections with the police establishment of counter-extremism, and we're not particularly trying to police thought or free speech. What we're instead focusing on is revealing where harm is happening and how it's organized, and trying to make that harm recognizable to third parties, because in our experience of harms is not what gets represented in the media narrative. It's absolute. If you look at the British media right now, the harms that trans people are experiencing within and outside of the healthcare system, as a result of the media as a result of the media industry, and in many other ways, those harms are nowhere to be seen, except somewhere down the line, when you see that hate crimes are up 80% again this year, 400% in the last 5 years in the UK. They just keep getting worse, and trans people. It's almost as if it's mysterious where this harm's coming from, and actually that's not the case. So our job is kind of making these things visible, and then trying to create the conditions that we'll be able to disrupt these processes creating harm, and getting away from this idea of like hate into just centering the harm at the center of it. So I'm going to be talking about conversion therapy. I've tried to broadly avoid talking about specific incidents of harm, but in general, some people might find it upsetting. People with direct experiences around this. So, in order to try and reveal and explain the structures that created the harms today, I'm going to talk about the history of science and technology as a force for suppressing gender dissidence. And it starts, well, I say it starts in the late 19th century. That might not be entirely true. You can go back to 16th century sodomy laws, but I think the modern era starts in the modern era of suppression of gender dissidence starts in the 19th century with the medicalization of sexual deviance. And simultaneously, at the same time in the late 19th century, we start getting the increased criminalization of gender variance. So there's, I've referenced here the Bolton Park case in 1870. 2 transvestites were arrested for using the women's toilet in London. There was a huge controversy because the establishment wanted to do them for homosexuality, but they were using the toilet and they weren't having sex. So this turned into a huge controversy for which I think they were eventually exonerated and freed, but it later gave rise to anti-homosexuality ordinances in Britain that Oscar Wilde was convicted under. There's also section 183 of the German Criminal Code in 1871, which was gross indecency, pretty much, but was like frequently from then on used to criminalize cross-dressing of any kind, which kind of set the tone for a lot of criminalization of transgender gender expression going forward. And there's this is the explosion, the Industrial Revolution bringing this explosion of new diagnoses for like different types of sexual deviance, because we've got to classify them all and like create maps now that we've got this scientific and industrial imperial culture that's spread from Europe through the rest of the world. And it's heavily influenced by the developing eugenic ideology at the time and scientific racism as well. And there's some great history on how this evolved in America from a book by C. Riley Snorton called Black on Both Sides. But there's also like if you search for inversion or sexual deviance or things like that, you find papers like sexual inversion amongst the primitive races and things like that, like really extremely racist stuff. The racism and the colonialism and the idea of like scientifically colonizing and discovering the world by defining things and diagnosing them and pathologizing them is like really core from the start of sexology as a field. And then this develops into the early 20th century, and like it's not all negative. There's the Weimar era sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin, who's obviously well known, pioneers the Hirschfeld Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft, and he innovates trying to use sexology to create a sort of integration, a legitimization and normalization of transvestites and eventually transsexuals within that, giving people transvestite passports. But he was also still operating within this kind of eugenic scientific paradigm in many ways. He was also, he's trying to create room for people to survive and live within it, and he did succeed to some extent. But it's also within this existing system, which is about understanding trans people as deviant from some norm and needing a special accommodation, I would say. And obviously that the Hirschfeld Institute was sacked by the Nazis and destroyed. Then there's the early American British gender clinics, which are directly inspired by Hirschfeld's work after that. And there's more information about Hirschfeld and his connection to eugenics in this recently published book, Racism and the Making of Gay Rights. This is cool. So then, late 20th century, we move into psychoanalysis and behavioral psychology becoming important. And they repeat this pattern that's been there from the start of scientific interest into gender diversity, the field of sexology, of going, how do we psychoanalyze transsexualism, transvestitism, how can we do behavioral psychology on it? There's also the relatively recently discovered hormone technologies are experimentally used as criminal punishment for homosexuals from the 1950s onwards, trying to cure sexual deviance through drugging it away. And all of these new technologies, the first thing people do with them is to then go, okay, this is great, we've done this before, how do we suppress, how do we understand and analyze and control sexual deviance? And with the exception of Hirschfeld, who himself was gay, and it kind of changes his perspective because he's a collaborator with a lot of his patients. With the exception of him in history, quite a lot of the clinicians there's absolutely no room for trans people's subjectivity in the process of creating the knowledge that science is creating. Instead, trans people become a subject group to be kind of effectively dominated and analyzed from the outside as an object of science. So we've got Bancroft and Marx, who innovate technologies, torturing gay, transvestite, and people with fetishes with electrodes in the Maudsley Hospital in London. There's Lovaas and Riekes, who they invent ABA, which is a therapeutic mechanism for curing autism, and they apply the same technique. I say for curing autism, you should read sarcasm into that. That's a behavioral technique for punishing gender and sexual deviance as well, and trying to reaffirm more traditional gender roles. Then Lothstein starts creating new innovations with group therapy in the 1980s. Then Joseph Nicolosi invents reparative therapy in the 1990s. And at this point, gay people have reached a certain level of power and ability to be heard in public life. So Joseph Nicolosi was pretty much, he's dead now, which is good. But he's pretty much well regarded, like as a quack very shortly after he starts his work. And then there's Zucker and Bradley. Zucker kind of was a big inspiration for Nicolosi in some ways, but also Zucker and Bradley both maintain this behavioral approach on their and this is recorded on their patients, trying to, discourage young trans girls and trans feminine people assigned male at birth, children, 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds, discouraging them from playing with toys which are too girly, taking their toys away, punishing them, cutting their hair, and trying to encourage them to feel good about being more manly, and in some cases allegedly seeing it as like a success that they'd made a young trans feminine person he started becoming more aggressive towards his mother, and that was seen as a success because that was more masculine. And the idea that like they'd inculcated misogyny and enough anger that like this small child had become violently angry against their mum was seen as a success is just absolutely astounding. And that is relatively recent, and a lot of Zucker's patients have spoken up about how that impacted them. There's also, throughout this whole thing, there are people creating studies where they report success for treatments like exorcism, and that's like, in the scientific literature, cheerful, like, well, they exorcise this person and they're not trans now, they're not gay now, like all that kind of thing. Little credible on long-term evidence ever emerges, but the point of this evidence that's being created is not to persist long-term. The point is to create a kind of science that objectifies and disempowers trans people as well as gay people. The distinction between trans and gay people is rarely that clearly defined in any of this research either. So us already talked about the anti-gender movement. The anti-gender movement comes into this in the 2010s, and it's a global surge of nationalist, patriarchal, transphobic, racist, reactionary activism. And one of the theories about what's triggered it is that gay marriage more or less succeeded in quite a lot of the world. If not gay marriage, then civil partnerships, but various forms of legitimization of same-sex relationships happened. And around like 2012 to 2014 in Europe, in America, in a lot of other places. And the religious right, particularly the Catholic Church, recognized it was losing a battle and piled a lot of resources into trying to create these anti-gender narratives. So in terms of how that relates to conversion therapy, a lot of the conversion therapy groups are, a lot of the organizations that are doing this from an anti-gender perspective are many of the same people who are involved in promoting what used to be like homosexuals anonymous groups. Now they're supporting support for gender-confused children and continuing previous traditions of suppression. And they've still got these technologies for suppression that come out of the history that I've talked about here already. Obviously, they're seeding media with conversion success stories, the same as they have done since like the 1970s. And that creates confusion because you see a citation, unless you're a scientist, a lot of people won't read the citations. That's just how it works. And they use group therapy, they use behavioral therapy, they use something that's called exploratory therapy, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The exorcisms continue, corrective rape and sexual violence often play a role, but it's a bit more obscure, it's less part of formal practices for reasons of rape is criminal. It's not necessarily very widely prosecuted, but it's not something that people put down in like, what are we doing, what's our methodology, and so on. And there's also DIY conversion therapy manuals which exist, and they collate all of the techniques in the above, and like disinformation, group therapy approaches, and all the rest of it. And they collate that into like a form that can then be distributed without it ending up landing on the responsibility of people whose medical license might be affected if they got in trouble, or people who are registered as psychotherapists who might lose their registration. So there's like this new expansion into finding ways to turn it underground while maintaining the kind of intellectual mechanisms informing how they do these practices. So on the group therapies, on the point of the group therapy, I'm talking about this partly because I think it's important to talk about the specifics and how these things function, because how they function is key to resisting them and key to interrupting them. So on the group therapy angle, they set up these groups with anti-trans countercultures. People organizing these groups make sure that they're seeded with a lot of true believers to start with. So you'll have people who have been part of like ex-gay and ex-trans movements from like 20 years back who will be like dominating these spaces and creating and facilitating the culture in order to make sure that the new people that they bring in are kind of, any support that they're seeking from the group is dominated by people who have a pre-existing culture of denying trans people existence and in some cases denying homosexuality as well. And they create these dynamics of responsibility for helping each other to not be trans. And so people who are part of these groups if they feel like, you know, I've got to transition, I've got to do this for myself, there's too much distress for me, the others in the group will say, oh, you can't let us down. And this is something we kind of observe watching. We're in contact with people who have left these groups. This is something we've learned from talking to them, as well as from monitoring some groups that are doing this on an ongoing basis right now today. And it basically works like 12-step groups, like Homosexuals Anonymous. You have people who will kind of push you to stick with it, stick with the plan. Like sure, this hasn't worked so far, but maybe if you try harder and you carry on with it. And it's very focused on acceptance of being uncomfortable. The behavioral therapy is still going on. This involves a program of like behavioral psychology since the 1960s and Skinner boxes is about, you know, you reward someone when they do the thing you want, you punish them when they don't do the thing you don't want. Sometimes if you're a less evil behavioralist, you take away, you don't worry about the punishments, you just try and do encouragements, but it all works pretty much the same way. And this is often mixed with, these sorts of reinforcement and discouragement are often mixed with group therapy aspects. Trying to get people to like, someone who doesn't feel like they identify with womanhood, saying like, no, actually womanhood is great and you need to embrace being a woman, and they might feel a fundamental disconnect with it. They might have expressed that and told other people about it, but there's a kind of mixture of group and other approaches to saying like, no, that feeling is wrong, that's just some disease in your head, and you don't need to give in to that. And also, you should think about how great this thing that makes you really, really uncomfortable actually is. You should just deny all of the feelings that you're having about yourself and take on someone else's feelings. And having that like reaffirmed, that sort of process of self-denial and yielding. It's like basically gaslighting, yielding to other people's views of what's right and wrong for you. And also this in terms of, this is also something that happens in terms of children, because parenting is already kind of heavily engaged with a framework for discipline. The behavioral side of things involves like, you know, if you stop playing, if you stop, you know, braiding your hair, you can like have a nice thing, you can have a cookie. If you don't cut your hair, and just trying to behaviorally reinforce particular traditionally gendered behaviors. And it's not always that cut and dried. Like there's a degree to which some people are like, well, we don't believe in gender stereotypes, but you need to like stop thinking you're trans. So like there's a secularization of these approaches. It's not always about very traditional gender roles. Sometimes it's like, well, we know we can't convert the trans person into traditional gender roles, but we can get them to we can try and stop them from thinking of themselves as a trans person, even though, you know, they can't stop thinking of themselves as a trans person and understanding themselves this way, because that's the self-understanding that comes naturally when you're trans. And then there's the other thing is this exploratory therapies, which is having a new resurgence now starting in the late 2010s, and you'll see a lot of newspaper stories about this. Essentially, this is like, we will send you to psychotherapy and you will stay in psychotherapy until they've found out what's wrong with you. And you start off with the assumption that there's something wrong, and you're exploring to find out what that is. And if you go through anyone's history for long enough, you'll find like some primal injury in their history, like you didn't get along with your brother, and that's why you want to like replace him, or like your relationship with your father was bad, and that's why you want to be a girl, or like anything. Like you can psychoanalyze your way into arguing that someone's the gender expression that feels natural to a given person is somehow related to some damage that was done to them. If you start at that position, you'll find it. Okay, so all of these come from an initial problem, and that's scientific and religious conversion practices are united in restricting trans-subjectivity. These are technologies that were largely created without trans people, about trans people, and the influences, well, I've talked a lot about conversion therapy, the influence of that process actually runs through a lot of transition medicine, because the transition medicine has also not had much, okay, I'll hurry up, sorry. So, what technologies do we build? So, one of the things I'm working on a lot of is recording, documenting, trying to understand the harm as experienced and understood by trans people. I've got a clip here from the 1974 Transsexual Transvestite Conference in Leeds, and like they're talking at the time about being subjected to electroshock therapy, like just being tortured with electrodes for the sake of stopping them being trans. And like, this is, bringing our subjectivity back is like an absolutely key part of how we fight this back. I can't emphasize that enough. The other thing is taking control of our healthcare. Like there's a massive explosion right now in DIY trans healthcare as well as DIY trans healthcare research. I've mentioned the Transfem Science page. Like a lot of trans people are taking away control from the medical establishment because the medical establishment has been so resistant to trans people having any sort of say in our own healthcare. Mutual aid. People who are isolated are really vulnerable to being abused. Conversion therapy is a form of abuse. Having points of contact where people can say, hi, I'm being tortured, my parents are sending me to this shrink who keeps trying to tell me that like everything I know about myself is wrong. You know, just giving people a space to not be isolated, to find support. You know, I know of people who've been, you know, they're under threat of being kicked out of home and they don't know what to do. So mutual aid groups, you know, they sort things out for homeless people and help them survive. I'm going to talk. This is a really important part about diversity and intersectionality is, and I think us talked briefly about this. In the UK, the fight back against conversion therapy, one of the most effective things fighting back against the religious conversion therapy movement was LGBT Christians, including like evangelical LGBT Christians, basically managing to coordinate with various church bodies to get like a major church statement against conversion therapy. So like people organizing in their own communities, like we can't just take a sort of scientific rationalist approach to this. We need to be talking to people and not just like assuming there's like a single secularist kind of approach to things that's going to help solve problems. And this goes especially for the case where a lot of trans people in faith communities, people of color might be more vulnerable, more isolated, especially because of racism inside the trans community. So it's something that we'd like have to break down those barriers inside our community, break down the inequalities inside our community in order to be there for them. So yeah, it's up to us to create technologies for liberation. That's my takeaway point here, and it's. Yeah, we're experimenting in our own freedom, and that's how the better we are at breaking down those barriers inside our community groups, the better we will be able to reuse those lessons that we learn, those technologies that we build across different groups. So,
thank you so much for this wonderful talk. All right. So since I'm a philosopher, I kind of like realized that you have like shown that different kinds of ways of understanding science. You were like presenting a conception of science where you say it's always value laden, especially against LGBTQ people. Whereas Oz presented more of a way of saying, well, there is a conception of science that is supposedly neutral, and then there are those people that they do bad science, and actually it's more about values, so we should go away and not think that science could. We both agreed on the fact that science won't save us, but. I thought especially about your talk now, like creating, like we have a long history of like ACT UP has created a long history of people actually taking charge of technologies, taking charge of medicine, people actually studying to become doctors, studying to become lawyers, using science and the conception of the patients, of the patient themselves being active basically, the AIDS crisis has changed a lot how patients interact with doctors. And I think I believe that we can see it in good practice with trans people as well already, that this influenced trans medicine as well. So I wondered if, since you're already nodding, you're probably not all against science, because there's also a good way of like appropriating it. Maybe you want to say some more about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a technologist. I'm a technologist. I guess, a critical technologist. So, my day job is in tech as well. So, I'm not against science at all. I think we need to understand science as a body of knowledge that has a history and has politics to it, and that's so. Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, and then my question to Oz would be, maybe I misrepresented what you were talking about. Maybe you want to correct me, but the question would be almost the same. If you basically, what you were showing is that the way they are using science is supposedly value neutral, but it's value laden. And therefore, they're doing something wrong, and they're doing not good science. But feminist science critique has shown us that science is always value-laden, and the question is rather, what kind of values are behind the sciences, and what in a good science means that the values are transparent, and that we're actually doing good science and showing, and with a good aim, with a good political aim. So don't you think that science could be appropriated as well to do good trans science?
Yeah, I guess in no particular order, I absolutely agree that that there could be a degree of appropriation, and in fact has been a degree of appropriation. One of my favorite things that I have found in doing this work and digging into the archives is trans people in the 80s and 90s, particularly in the 90s, using the internet to coordinate their own studies and like evidence gathering to fight back against attempts to exclude trans knowledge from things like the formulation of medical standards. But to give you some context for like the response that this gets, when a trans scientist did a study that demonstrated that the restrictions that the gender identity clinics were putting on people were completely unjustified and unjustifiable and could be weakened, the response of WPATH was not to include it in the standards of care or even to formally evaluate it as part of the papers setting out the standards of care. It was to mention in a footnote that because this study was supported by the consumers, it should be seen as like biased and not taken seriously. Like literally, because some of our patients agree with this, it must be fake. Like that's so. Like, do I agree? Do I believe that science can do stuff? Yes, and I do so in line with a feminist philosophy of science perspective. Like, you know, I have read Helen Longino and I have read Heather Douglas, and I am largely along their lines, and I firmly believe that that engagement can change things. But at the same time, you know, you mentioned like ACT UP, and I'm not sure if I would say that the sort of politics of patient involvement in healthcare originates in ACT UP. I think that it can be traced a decade earlier, really, to the women's movement, to the Boston Health Collective, to the general co-opting of the politics of demedicalization. But if we're talking ACT UP, my grand advisor was Stephen Epstein, who wrote this amazing book called Impure Science, which if anyone hasn't read, they should. It is the story of basically how ACT UP changed how scientific research around drugs is done. But one of the interesting things about that book is that it also shows that that process of engagement also changed the activists, right? And it changes the dynamics within movements, because you can't fit everyone who's in a movement in the FDA chairman's office. And some people end up specializing and separating out and being in some ways closer to the scientists than they are to everyone else. And so it's not that I don't think science can't do good things. It's that I think that, first off, that this is that science never only does good things. But second, also that the problem we're looking at here, this question of what futures do we want to enable, or what is the happiness outcome of like this surgical procedure or this hormone procedure, the only way to answer that in a really robust way that isn't is horrifyingly ethical, horrifyingly unethical. And the only ways to answer that question in an ethical way are extremely unscientific. And so the reason for this is essentially that what we are dealing with is a trans-scientific question, something that looks like a scientific question, right? Like what are the outcomes of this procedure? But that isn't, because it's also about, before that, what values do we understand as worth promoting? Like what does happiness look like? Are the people we're fighting even prepared to conceive of happy trans people? Because if the answer is no, then we shouldn't be screwing around doing studies of how happy we are. They don't care. So yeah, it's not that I don't think that science can't be valuable. It's that I think that for science to come to be valuable, it has to be after we've agreed on what we're measuring and what would be a good outcome. And I don't think that that's the case. Wow, I could just have said that sentence and saved everyone's time. I'm so sorry.
Okay, so then I'm making probably more transparent why I'm particularly interested in this question. Because I believe, or why I brought up ACT UP, because I think, but you're right, the women movement, of course, is where it goes back to, is that we as trans people, we don't have the privilege to say that we cannot care about healthcare. We have to. We have to care how they treat us, with what they treat us, and it's not just a question of access, it's also a question of when things go wrong, who is helping us? How often do things go wrong? And I have been seeing for a long time now that people are underinformed about the procedures they get. They have bad aftercare because they weren't told what to do. They weren't told where to go if something goes wrong with their surgery. If anybody has problems with their hormones, nobody knows what to do. Even the doctors don't, and I think that is also a problem of science. I believe we need more science to actually figure out what are the bad side effects and how to treat the bad side effects, instead of, and we don't have the privilege of saying, well, science is bad and they don't treat us well, so we refrain. So this is
to be clear.
Okay, I just finished my sentence, and that's why I brought it up.
Yep.
I don't think that you're against this. And to you, because you were speaking more about psychology, I believe we also kind of need, I don't know, trauma therapists to help us get through the shit we experienced. So I'm a bit more of I hope that we manage to find ways of using the technologies for us. So I want to push this, and yeah, okay, maybe I give Mallory, because you're so excited now, I give Mallory the floor.
That was a big question. It was about... Okay, I'm sorry, I'm struggling to remember the question.
I said that I believe that we don't have the privilege of just saying that scientists are bad to us and we can just live our happy lives better without them.
Yep.
I believe that we actually need more science to help us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and Okay, so for me, it's about ownership and our ownership of scientific processes that determine things, determine the course of our lives, determine our access to healthcare. I don't think it's a question about science, and don't really think it's a question of values, because a lot of the scientists that are experimenting on us and like letting us down in a lot of ways, a lot of them got into their jobs because they want to help people. Their idea of what helps people is not necessarily the same as our idea of what helps people. But some of them are genuinely well-intentioned, and without trans ownership of procedures and policy around it, that will amount to nothing for me. And that's why I talk about, the shift to DIY. So I'll explain a little bit about the current healthcare crisis in the UK for trans people. There's been, since more information has become available about trans people, a lot more trans people have come out. We've got the GIC system, wherein the people running the GIC system have
quickly say what GIC means.
Sorry, the gender identity clinics. So the gender identity clinics act as the diagnostic centres. You go in, they will talk to you, they will diagnose you, some of them will ask you really inappropriate questions like about your sexuality. Others of them are more liberal, but in any case, wherever you go for healthcare, you go to a gender identity clinic. And those are bottlenecks. Those are bottlenecks that are designed from a history that is designed to try and stop you from being trans, but if they can't stop you from being trans, they will help you transition. And that's kind of the history of them. And because of that, it's impossible for them to provide everyone who needs healthcare with healthcare, because they're not set up for it. And every time trans people have activated in the UK against this, the gender clinicians have become increasingly angry, and they start talking about how political it is these days to start to do the things we used to do to stop people from transitioning. Nowadays it's too political, and it's really threatening their power. Rather than listening to trans healthcare activists, they perceive it as a threat to their power. And it's entirely because this system is owned by them and not by us. So, for me, the entire thing comes back to ownership. Take it 2 steps back. It's about ownership. It's not about science. It's not about evidence. It's about their comfort levels with what they see as their property and ability to objectify us.
Okay, Os. It's like we are almost at the end. Just Os can give their answer, and then we're going to open to the wider audience. So it's your finishing words.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mallory, and I think that was eloquent and beautifully posed. My only comment was, I also agree that we need more science. I just don't think that the fight's over should trans healthcare be legal or not, and should it be publicly funded. I don't think those are about science. I agree that we need more scientific studies, and that we need those to be owned by us. But it's the question of what is the complication rate for this dosage of hormone versus that dosage of hormone, that is a scientific question that we should get the answer of, and that we should own the process of finding out. But the question of, is that complication rate acceptable, or should we ban this medication? That's not a scientific question. That's a values one. And if we can't keep showing up to that conversation being but the graph says, they're just going to sucker punch us and go through our pockets while we're out. That's all that will happen.
Thank you both. Right, any questions? Now we've almost subverted a little bit the title of the whole panel. Science might save us in certain respects now. No, okay. Anybody online?
We have a question from the online audience. So did you study the behavior of colonialism toward gender transitions in other cultures too? And what about its role in cancelling diversity?
So I'm not, I should clarify, I'm not an academic. I play one on the internet, but that's like, I don't even have a degree. So in terms of colonialism, I can't speak to that question. What I can say is that there are very, very different histories for how the science on gender medicine has evolved over years. I know from talking to, I talked a lot about building networks and building community for resisting harm. One of the things I've done a lot of is building international community with other activists in places where trans people are also facing various forms of organized harm, and like compare notes on how they're similar and different. So this is extremely anecdotal. This is not scientific at all. I will say that, like, for instance, when I talk to activist colleagues in Poland, their entire gender identity clinic history system, because it's in the Eastern Bloc, it evolved in a completely different trajectory. Some of their things are much more liberated than us. Some of the legal things are much more oppressive than us. Yeah, so like the history matters, and people should be organizing to uncover or read up on your local history and try and understand how that's affected things, because there are hidden like traps when you're trying to unpick the power structures that are maintaining the way things are right now. The devil is in the details, and a lot of those details are in history somewhere. So, like, I think anyone trying to organize for liberated trans healthcare needs to localize that to themselves, and yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk, both of you. It was super interesting. And I was wondering, because I was also working in that field, especially in the medical healthcare of trans people. And what I was, expecting was also that ownership is a problem, and also medicalization is a general problem. But what I also saw was a process of liberalization in the medical sciences, especially, as Oz said, in the W path, like the standards of care, for example. They changed the process of the transitioning process that had existed before a lot, and it also changed the language, also, like the diagnosis changed a lot during the last couple of 10 years maybe. So we are at the moment, I have the feeling, in a process of big change. In Germany, for example, there will be a self-determination law, hopefully coming this year, which will replace the transgender law that we have at the moment. Which is absolutely not on time anymore, and I have the feeling, especially the medical system is definitely changing somehow, and also somehow integrating trans people. Not as it should be, definitely, but I have the feeling there is some change going on. And the question, I mean, for me it is clear medicalization in terms of diagnosis should definitely end soon. And on the other hand, as Resa-Philip said, we still need, the medical system for hormones and the chirurgical interventions. And the problem there is more that we have the old style system, and like all the operations that are available at the moment are still super harmful. And I would rather say the medical system should go there and go and change the operations, for example. So yeah, I would be interested what you think about, like, is there a liberalization or don't you think there is one? Because I saw one.
So there's conflict. I think there's conflict. One of the articles I put out with Trans Safety Network a few months back was about a United States WPATH doctor who was the chair of the Child and Adolescent Committee for the new standards of WPATH standards of care chapter on child and adolescent care, and like we discovered a few months ago that she had also endorsed a book by a Christian therapist who's very, very well known for a 30-year, 20, at least 20 years, possibly 30-year history of involvement in research, basically enabling conversion therapy. And that's like a senior WPATH figure. So I think there's change, but there's also, there's a real conflict going on between this largely kind of cisgender-dominated professional organization and trans people fighting to have a voice within it and from outside of it. And yeah, I would say there's conflict. There's liberalization. Trans people are making wins. We're taking wins as a wider community, but it's kind of not something I see as driven by WPATH. It's something that's driven by the activist community fighting to take control of our own destinies.
Os, maybe you want to say something to that too?
Yeah. So I think I agree with Mallory on everything. I should just have that on a card, honestly, or maybe one of those stamps, and just every time I read something of Mallory's. Anyway, I also think that the liberalization within WPATH, even setting aside like how contested it's been within WPATH, I think it's also been on terms that in some ways like reinforce the overall questions of power, right? So for anyone who doesn't care about the internal politics of WPATH and also the internal politics of trans research, this will be intensely boring. But half the time when you see papers that are about here's what we know about transness, they will have at least 1 or 2 or 3 Dutch people on the papers. Now, this is partly because WPATH is an increasingly international organization, but it's mostly because the Netherlands has a extremely concentrated trans healthcare system where it is publicly accessible, but also only through a couple of hospitals. And also those hospitals are university hospitals. And so all of the physicians are also professors or PhD students. And so they generate a lot of the research, right? And so there is this fundamental tension and conflict of interest, right? Because their incentive is against allowing any doctor to decide if trans people should have access to care. Their incentive is, they're trying to evaluate ethics and how treatment should be done with one eye towards like the needs of the patient, but another eye towards, I could get a paper out of this. And I bring them up because if we take a step back and we look at the grounds of the liberalization, a lot of the grounds of that liberalization has looked like has been this transition in, didn't think of that, but it is technically a pun. This transition in the last couple of versions of the standards of care to evidence-based treatment or evidence-based medicine, and they start talking about like how rigorous is the evidence for this. And that's where a lot of the liberalization has come from, has been people being able to point out, okay, there is literally zero evidence that this 2-year wait period is necessary. Cut it out. But there are some caveats there, right? First is shifting to EBM, while it produces some liberalizations, leaves that power structure intact. In fact, it actually enhances the power of the physicians who are also scientists who are in these highly concentrated systems, because now the standards of care are driven by basically what they say. It's what they say with graphs instead of what they say with random suppositions, but they're still the ones who ultimately have the power and resources to decide what questions tend to get asked, and therefore what the range of answers can be. Second, they could have got rid of those principles 30 goddamn years ago if they just asked us. And we know this because I have the minutes. I have the minutes from the very first meeting where they set up WPath and they debated, should we actually have a trans person on the committee? And they concluded by one vote, no, because they're crazy. And so that's why the first versions of the standards of care did not include any trans people.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
This is happening in the UK as well. There's this current thing going through called the Cass Review, where the government has commissioned this massive review into transgender healthcare for children. And one of the first things that they did for the Cass Review, they set up an oversight body to make sure this is super evidence-based medicine. Blah 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 blah. One of the things that was one of their things that made that review scientific and made it appropriate and due process for research ethics and so on, one of the key principles underlying that was that they made it a rule that none of the people in the oversight board would be people affected by gender medicine. Now, anyone with any ounce of research in medical ethics would understand that that's horrific. It's a kangaroo court. They're marking their own cisgender people have stolen something from us, and this is funded by this is the national UK study on this, and that's happened in the last 2 years, and it makes me absolutely hopping mad. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a really good illustration, right? Of yeah, even when there are moments of liberalization, my question is not only what is being said, but also who is allowed to say it. And I think that what's being said is changing, but who's allowed to say it all too often isn't, right? It's great that in theory, the gender identity clinic will now not throw you out for being gay or for being married or for not having a job or for having done drugs once. All of that is awesome. It's better than the alternative, and I am going to do some sodomy and heroin just to celebrate. But it's still, the fact of the matter is that there is a 20 to 30 year delay and gap between when trans people say a thing and when cis people start saying it and it starts being taken seriously. And I'm seeing what people say change, but all too often it's still that we don't get to be the ones defining the questions, defining what questions are worth investigating, who owns the data. The people who have the resources to do things that fit that EBM paradigm of thousands of people as rigorous as possible, that's the big gender identity clinics, that's the big hospitals that have that academic cachet, and that also by definition are also the creepiest and leariest place, because they wouldn't exist if it wasn't for deliberately resisting efforts to broaden out access to trans healthcare to other providers. So I think it's a tension, and I agree that there's this liberalization, but I want to see, I want to put it this way, I want to see an all trans panel talking about how science should be done for transness at the next WPath symposia. I want to see 0 panels with cis people on involving any question like that. When that happens, then when it happens there as well as here, then I will believe that it's more than just a change in statements, it's a change in power as well.
Well, okay, probably not a WePath conference thing, but maybe we can make that happen to have a conversation about how it should be. So I was already informed that we only have 2 minutes left, so I would give Mallory a minute to have a final thought. And do you still want to say something? Then no? Okay, then I give 2 minutes to Mallory.
Okay, so TLDR, we need lots of different skills. We need diversity of tactics. We need people to organize in your communities. We need people to find out who's isolated and make them not isolated anymore. We need freedom, we need choices, we need ownership of things, we need resources that we control, which means we need to make those resources happen. What else? We need monitoring. We need to make harms targeting trans people matter, and that's a big part of my organization, Trans Safety Network, is about making those harms matter, because when you have our voices shut out of things, then those harms don't matter anymore, because our perspectives that care about those harms don't exist. And yeah, like this is, I think the big thing is trying to take back ownership of the means of, you know, life, basically, and survival and thriving.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talks and final words and the conversation. It was, I'm very happy now. I hope you are too.
Yeah,
and the audience.
Thank you. I have to say I'm very happy too, so we are all happy. But also from this keynote we understood there are still a lot of things to do. So I hope that this is also an invitation to go on. And now I say we will do 15 minutes break and we will go on with the panel Hacking Biocodes. That is also a lot about technology of liberations, also connected with artistic practice. So thank you again, Os, Mallory and Resa-Philip. And Os, we hope to see you soon. The weather was waiting for you, it was 35 degrees in Berlin like 3 years ago when you came. Only these 2 days of conference was really waiting for you, but maybe next year we invite you again, it will be again 35 degrees. So thank you so much, and see you in 15 minutes. And I want to remind that tomorrow there will be the workshop with Mallory and Os again. So please also remember to register. It's a very important workshop about mapping the anti-trans movement. So just to remind that is still open.